For 10,000 years, most human lives were set to a rhythm you can still imagine. Dawn and dusk, planting and harvest, the slow arithmetic of seasons. Then, in the space of a few generations in late 18th century Britain, that rhythm was ruptured. A seam of coal, a handful of machines, and a set of social and legal conditions combined to make production faster, cheaper, and on a scale nobody had known before. The result was not only extraordinary wealth for some and new goods for many, but also deep dislocation, crowded cities, poisoned rivers, relentless factory discipline, and patterns of economic dominance that reshaped the globe. I'm Tim, and today we're going to walk through the real, sometimes uncomfortable story behind the phrase Industrial Revolution. I'll show you 3 genuinely shocking truths about that era, and explain why each of them matters. If you like deep history explained clearly, subscribe for more. To understand why this change happened where and when it did, it helps to think of 5 pillars, conditions that stacked together like supports under a new kind of economy. Each pillar by itself was important. Together they made rapid industrialization possible. The first pillar was agricultural change. Better crop rotations, selective breeding, and enclosure of common land had been moving productivity upward for a century. That meant fewer people were needed on farms. It didn't mean sudden comfort for everyone. Many displaced rural workers struggled. But it did mean a pool of labor ready to work in new industries. In short, agriculture freed people and labor for the factory. The second pillar was political and legal stability. Britain's courts and property laws provided predictable rules for investment. Merchants and inventors could patent ideas, own land, borrow against property, and expect courts to enforce contracts. That legal certainty encouraged risk-taking on a scale that mattered when large sums were needed to build mills, mines, and canals. The third pillar was geography and maritime advantage. An island with an intricate coastline and navigable rivers, Britain had access to cheap transport by water. Ports and coasts linked producers to markets at home and abroad. The same geography also made it relatively straightforward to move bulky raw materials, like coal and iron, where they were needed. Fourth was a culture of practical experiment and scientific knowledge. The so-called culture of improvement ran through universities, coffee houses, workshops, and gentlemen's clubs. Men and women with curiosity and mechanical skill shared ideas. Artisans learned from experimenters, and empiricism fed invention. This was not pure theory divorced from craft. It was a lively interchange between tinkers, mechanics, and patrons. Finally, and perhaps most paradoxically, Britain combined relatively high wages for labor with unusually cheap, accessible coal. High wages created economic incentive to save labor through machines. Cheap coal made it possible to power those machines without prohibitive fuel costs. That combination, labor-saving technology profitable in a fuel-rich environment, was a powerful engine of change. These 5 pillars help explain why the first large-scale industrial transformation started in Britain. But the story becomes real when we look at a concrete industry. Textiles. Textiles were the wedge. For centuries, spinning and weaving had been cottage industries, families working in rural houses taking yarn to a weaver's loom, living with the pace set by daylight and the seasons. Then a handful of inventions multiplied output and shifted work into factories. The flying shuttle, invented by John Kay, allowed a single weaver to throw the shuttle across the warp faster than before, speeding up weaving but creating a bottleneck. More yarn was needed. James Hargreaves's spinning jenny multiplied the number of spindles a single worker could tend. Suddenly, one hand could operate many threads. Richard Arkwright's water frame used water power to produce stronger yarn suitable for warp threads, and Samuel Crompton's spinning mule combined features of the jenny and water frame to create fine, strong, high-volume yarn. Each machine, in effect, moved work from the household to purpose-built mills. Where a family once spun by firelight, factories now ran rows of mechanized spindles that hummed day and night. These machines offer a clear microcosm of the revolution. Productivity leapt, goods became cheaper and more uniform, whole towns reorganized around mills. Manchester, once a market town, swelled into what contemporaries called Cottonopolis, a city whose fortunes depended on textile mills, the merchants who financed them, and ports that moved raw cotton and finished cloth across the world. But the textile boom also opened up the first big shock, the unprecedented scaling of energy use. Shock number 1. The scale of energy unleashed was orders of magnitude greater than anything humans had relied on before. For millennia, our work had been powered by human and animal muscle, wind, and water. The shift to fossil fuels, first coal, meant access to concentrated storable energy that could be summoned almost anywhere. Coal did not depend on seasonal flows or reliable winds. It powered pumps, furnaces, and eventually steam engines that turned heat into motion. This is shocking not because the old world had never burned coal, the Romans had used it, but because late 18th century industry used coal on a scale that transformed landscapes and economies. Mines dug deeper into the earth, colliers transported tons of coal to cities and mills. Smoke became a defining feature of the skyline. Coal's abundance in accessible seams near industrial centers, especially in Britain, created a comparative advantage. Factories could operate continuously, not intermittently. The practical effect was a massive multiplication of available mechanical energy. Machines could be larger, faster, and more numerous. The consequence was societal and environmental. Landscapes were scarred by extraction. Air and water pollution increased where coal was burned and waste dumped. Rivers used for processing became fouled with chemical and textile wastes. The atmosphere in industrial towns turned smoky and sulfurous. At the same time, coal's energy density made large-scale production profitable, and that profit was a major driver of global economic power in the 19th century. What made coal's energy useful were inventions that turned heat into work. Early steam designs had been known for a while, but the industrial context demanded practical machines for pumping and power. Thomas Newcomen built an early atmospheric engine that could pump water from mines. It was clunky and inefficient, but it worked, and every mine that could not be drained by simpler means needed such a pump. James Watt's later improvements, most importantly the separate condenser, dramatically raised efficiency. Watt's innovations, produced in partnership with Matthew Boulton, allowed steam engines to be smaller, more powerful, and less costly to run. They were no longer confined to mines. They could drive mill wheels, permit factories to be located away from rivers, and ultimately power locomotives and ships. This leads naturally to materials, the other side of the industrial triangle. Iron, once produced in small quantities with charcoal, was transformed by new methods that used coal and its derivative, coke. Coke-fired blast furnaces produced pig iron in greater volumes. Innovations like puddling and rolling helped convert brittle pig iron into malleable wrought iron, suitable for machinery, structural beams, and bridges. The Iron Bridge in Shropshire, built in the late 18th century, became an emblem. Iron not only made machines, it redefined architecture and infrastructure. Stronger iron meant larger machines, longer bridges, and later iron rails that could bear heavy loads and high speeds. As textile mills multiplied, mines sank deeper, steam engines grew more common, and iron structures carried the weight of this new economy. The pattern was cumulative. Each technological advance enabled the next. But the mechanical story is only half of the revolution. The social consequences were immediate, and for many people, devastating. Shock number 2. The human cost in industrial towns was vast and often hidden in plain sight. Migration from countryside to city accelerated at a rate that overwhelmed urban infrastructure. Villages bulged into towns. Houses were subdivided into cramped, windowless rooms. Sanitation lagged far behind population growth. Disease, cholera, typhus, and other epidemics spread quickly where water was contaminated and drainage was poor. Contemporary observers recorded mortality rates in some industrial neighborhoods that were markedly higher than in rural areas. Infant mortality soared in factory towns. These were not universal conditions everywhere, and standards varied across places and employers, but the aggregate effect was undeniable. Industrialization created large pockets of concentrated human suffering, even as it produced new wealth. Factory discipline imposed a different form of coercion. Where cottage industry often involved flexible hours governed by household needs, factory work required relentless, regimented schedules set by the ticking of machines. Attendance, punctuality, and and output became matters of contract, and sometimes of physical punishment. Children were among the most vulnerable. Factories and mines employed boys and girls who could be made to operate dangerous machinery or crawl through narrow mine passages. Their low wages made them attractive to employers. Early factory acts eventually limited child labor and working hours, but such reforms were belated and partial. Resistance took many forms. Some workers protested by destroying machinery, a movement commonly lumped under the term Luddism, though the origins were complex and localized. Other responses included the formation of trade unions, craft associations, and political movements demanding reform. Intellectuals and artists, romantics like William Blake, offered stinging critiques, publishing images of dark satanic mills where human dignity seemed sacrificed to profit. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels later analyzed these developments as structural problems of industrial capitalism, emphasizing class conflict and exploitation. Those critiques helped fuel political mobilization, not just in Britain, but across Europe and beyond. Urbanization and labor changes also produced new social orders. A commercial and industrial middle class emerged, merchants, manufacturers, managers, who enjoyed new forms of consumption, investment, and civic power. At the same time, a working class, newly concentrated and organized, began to assert rights and demand representation. The Industrial Revolution thus reshaped social hierarchies as much as it reshaped landscapes. Another essential piece of the puzzle was infrastructure, canals, railways, and steamships, that turned local production into national and international markets. Canals like the Bridgewater Canal cut costs dramatically for heavy goods such as coal. The canal mania of the late 18th and early 19th centuries reflected a growing recognition. Transport mattered. Then came the railways. Early engineers like Richard Trevithick experimented with steam locomotion. George Stephenson later helped realize practical, reliable railways, culminating in lines such as Liverpool to Manchester. Railways shrank distances, standardized time, and made the rapid movement of goods and people normal. Steamships extended the logic to the seas, reducing journey times and linking imperial markets. All of these developments combined to create another major shock. Shock number 3. The pace of urban growth and the speed at which social and economic relations reorganized were astonishingly fast. Cities that had been minor market towns before 1750 could become industrial metropolises by 1850. Entire economies reoriented around factories, mines, and transport networks within a few generations. That speed made adaptation difficult, for workers, for laws, and for health and housing systems. Institutions designed for agrarian societies were ill-suited to the challenges of dense industrial life. The scale and rapidity of change meant that many of the necessary social responses, public health measures, labor protections, urban planning, lagged behind the pace at which people were forced to adapt. These 3 shocks, the massive increase in energy use, the profound human costs in growing industrial towns, and the astonishing speed of urbanization and economic reorganization, are connected. Coal enabled steam, steam allowed mass production concentrated people generated social crises, which in turn spurred political and intellectual reaction. Now let's widen the lens. Britain's lead did not automatically translate into identical development everywhere. Technologies traveled, but they were adapted and embedded differently in each national context. In Belgium, for example, industrialization followed with an early advantage. Resource endowments and textile expertise, combined with state support, produced integrated factories and a rapid diffusion of techniques. France industrialized more unevenly. Political upheavals, a strong artisanal tradition, and different legal arrangements created a patchwork of industrial growth. Germany's path was shaped by regional variations and a later consolidation of industrial power in the 19th century, with particular strengths in iron, chemicals, and later machinery. The United States combined abundant land, resources, and a culture of mechanical innovation with different labor relations and a vast internal market. Interchangeable parts and scale economies became important there. Japan's industrial transformation in the late 19th century under state-led modernization shows yet another model: active government involvement, selective adoption of Western technologies, and rapid social engineering. These variations underscore an essential point. The Industrial Revolution was not a single script repeated worldwide. It was a set of techniques and organizational changes that interacted with local institutions, resources, and politics to produce different outcomes. Ideas and reactions to industrialization were equally diverse. The Luddite protests, often mischaracterized as simply anti-technology, were in many places targeted responses to wage cuts, de-skilling, or the breaking of customary labor arrangements. Trade unions gradually emerged to protect workers' rights. The legal recognition of unions and the development of labor law were slow, contested processes. Intellectual critiques ranged from romantic poets who mourned the loss of pastoral life, to social theorists like Marx and Engels, who analyzed the structural impacts of capitalist production. Each critique offered a different diagnosis and different prescriptions, some moral, some political, some economic. By the mid-19th century, the story was beginning to move into a second wave. Innovations in steel production, later accelerated by Bessemer's process, and the harnessing of electricity and petroleum would reshape the industrial map again. But it's important to keep the waves distinct. The first industrial revolution centered on steam, coal, textiles, and iron. Steel, electricity, and the internal combustion engine belong to the later transformations that produced new industries and new global dynamics. Throughout this narrative, a few recurring trade-offs appear. Technologies increased productivity and lowered prices, expanding access to goods. Yet they also generated concentrated environmental impacts. Polluted rivers, smoky skies, and landscapes altered by mining. They enabled unprecedented wealth for some, and harsh exploitation for others. Legal and institutional frameworks, property rights, patent systems, and courts enabled investment. They also often delayed social protections for the vulnerable. The choices made by entrepreneurs, landowners, reformers, and governments set patterns that shaped work, health, and power for decades. A few brief clarifications of technical terms will help. Puddling was a metallurgical process that allowed the conversion of brittle pig iron into more workable wrought iron by stirring molten iron in a furnace to reduce carbon content. The spinning mule was a machine that combined features of other spinning devices to produce a finer, stronger thread, suitable for high-quality cloth. Newcomen's engine used atmospheric pressure and steam to pump water. Watt's separate condenser improved efficiency by preventing the repeated heating and cooling of the main cylinder. We should also be careful about causation. It would be wrong to say the Industrial Revolution was inevitable. It was the result of contingent factors: geography, legal systems, social institutions, individual inventors, and global markets coming together. Nor was it a simple story of technological triumph. Social, political, and environmental dynamics shaped what technologies could and could not do. The narrative is complex because history is complex. As we trace these changes, it's useful to remember that the Industrial Revolution also rewired global relations. Industrialized powers could produce manufactured goods cheaply and in volume. They needed raw materials and markets. That combination helped accelerate imperial expansion and reshape global trade networks. The center of economic gravity shifted, and countries that industrialized later had to navigate a world already structured by industrial capital and steam-powered transport. By the time we reached the mid-19th century, the legacy was obvious. Cities with new civic institutions were emerging. Some employers sought philanthropic reforms, schooling, and improved housing for workers, often out of paternalism or public pressure as much as compassion. Public health measures, better drainage, regulated water supplies, and sanitation gradually reduced epidemic outbreaks where they were implemented. Labor laws, child protection statutes, and the legalization of unions moved slowly, but had long-term effects. Scientific advances in engineering skill continued to compound productivity, while also producing new anxieties about machines, moral life, and social cohesion. Now, to return to the title that brought us here, what is the shocking truth about the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s? It is not a single sensational fact, but a cluster of facts that, when considered together, force a rethinking of the common image of progress as purely beneficial. First shock: The sheer scale of energy capture. By shifting from muscle and wind to fossil fuels, societies massively increased the energy available per person. That decision set the stage for modern industrial economies and for modern environmental consequences. The smoke and soot of the early factories were an early sign of a pattern that would expand with oil, gas, and later coal at industrial centers around the world. Understanding that shift helps explain not only 19th century landscapes, but also the long-run dynamics of resource use and environmental strain. Second shock, the human cost, especially in newly industrial towns. Economic historians and contemporaries agree that some of the darkest effects of early industrialization were the health crises, cramped housing, and dangerous workplaces concentrated in urban centers. These were not inevitable. Different policies and institutional responses could have mitigated some harms, but they were consequences of the speed and scale of change and of a legal economic regime that prioritized investment and property over immediate protections for labor. Third shock, the global rearrangement of power and the rapid social reorganization. Within a few generations, industrialization produced nations with unprecedented manufacturing capacity and international influence. That altered trade, politics, and conflict in ways that rippled outward from Europe and the Atlantic world to Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The speed of this rearrangement meant that cultural and political adaptation frequently lagged behind economic change, producing friction and conflict. None of these shocks implies a simple moral verdict. The Industrial Revolution also gave rise to mass-produced goods that improved living standards for many, fostered innovations in medicine and transport, and created new possibilities for leisure, education, and civic life. The paradox is that great material progress and deep social costs were two sides of the same historical process. If there is a final lesson, it is this. The Industrial Revolution was a demonstration of human ingenuity and collective organization, but it was also a story of choices, about energy sources, legal priorities, labor practices, and environmental stewardship. Those choices produced institutions and infrastructures that persist. The chimneys, rails, canals, and factories of the 19th century were not just relics. They were the foundation stones of modern economic life. The decisions made then about what to value, speed, cheapness, property rights, or worker protections, continue to shape our debates today. So consider this. When we benefit from goods produced at scale, when we accept cheap energy and fast transport as normal, we are living with echoes of decisions first made during the Industrial Revolution. Recognizing the shocks does not mean rejecting the technologies that followed. It means understanding the trade-offs and learning from them. Which of these revelations surprised you most? The scale of energy use, the human cost in industrial towns, or the speed of global realignment? Tell us in the comments. Share this video with someone who loves history, and if you want to follow the story forward, watch our next episode on how steel, electricity, and petroleum transformed the world in the second industrial wave. Thanks for watching. I'm Tim. See you next time.